The newsroom erupted as breaking alerts flashed across every screen, sirens of digital chaos filling the air. A sharp headline declared a scandal involving Richard Kane, the 45-year-old CEO of Kane Global, leaving his empire shaken. Richard stood in his glass-walled office, gripping the edge of his desk while employees whispered nervously outside. He whispered to himself, "Not today, not like this." His trusted advisor, Donovan, said, "Richard, the media will devour us unless we act fast." Panic spread as phones buzzed, reporters gathered, and allies hesitated. Every second felt like a countdown to destruction, the empire trembling under the weight of rumor and betrayal. Richard sank into his leather chair as the storm outside rattled against the glass walls. His phone buzzed relentlessly, but he ignored every call. Claire said, "You can't stay silent. Silence is blood to the media." Richard stared at the glowing skyline, his face caught between rage and disbelief. "I built this empire brick by brick," he muttered. "And now they tear it down in seconds." Claire placed a folder on his desk, her voice low but firm. "We need a strategy, not denial." The newsroom chatter outside seeped into the silence, a reminder that the world was listening, waiting for his downfall. The office door burst open as Michael Grant, the 48-year-old CFO, stormed in with fury. "Do you realize what this means?" he said, voice sharp. Richard shot him a glare. "I don't need another lecture." Michael slammed a stack of papers on the desk. "Shareholders are demanding answers, Richard. If you don't step up, they'll destroy us." Claire crossed her arms, her eyes flicking between the two men like a silent referee. Richard leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "If anyone thinks they can dethrone me, they'll regret it." Silence hung heavy, broken only by thunder rolling in the distance. Phones rang endlessly as the media frenzy reached a boiling point. Richard's assistant, Emily Carter, rushed in, her voice shaky. "Richard, journalists are at the gates." Richard's jaw tightened, his glare fixed on the window. Claire muttered, "The wolves smell blood." Michael sneered, "And you fed them." Emily clutched her tablet, her voice trembling. "They've uncovered internal memos." Richard stood, slamming his palm against the desk. "This is war." The storm outside cracked with thunder, mirroring the chaos inside the tower. Every second pulled the walls tighter, suffocating the last threads of control he held. The storm raged harder as Richard walked to the window, his reflection fractured by raindrops. "They'll never forgive me," he whispered. Claire's tone was steel. "Then make them fear you." Michael chuckled darkly. "Fear won't fix the numbers." Emily's voice cracked. "The press wants a statement within the hour." Richard turned, eyes blazing with resolve. "Then they'll get one." For the first time that night, his fear hardened into defiance. The empire was bleeding, but its king wasn't done fighting. The night pressed closer, carrying the weight of betrayal and the scent of coming war. Morning light crept across the skyline as Richard Kane entered the boardroom, his face pale with exhaustion. The table was already crowded with executives whispering like vultures. Donovan followed close, carrying a thick binder. Michael Grant leaned forward with an accusing glare. "Our stock dropped 12% overnight." Richard said, "Numbers can recover, but loyalty cannot." A silence fell heavy across the polished wood. Claire broke it, her voice sharp. "We must dictate the narrative, or the media will." Richard scanned the faces around him, realizing the room itself had become hostile ground. The empire was cracking from inside. Phones buzzed constantly on the table, every executive glancing nervously at screens. Richard's assistant Emily Carter entered quietly, handing him a tablet. Her voice trembled. "Investors demand a call within the hour." Richard muttered, "They smell weakness." Michael sneered, "Because you gave it to them." Claire's eyes narrowed as she snapped, "Enough, we don't have time for theatrics." Richard rose slowly, the weight of the empire pressing on his shoulders. He said, "I won't crawl to them. They'll hear strength, not apology." Outside, storm clouds still gathered, as if the weather conspired with his enemies. The meeting fractured as voices clashed, accusations hurled like daggers. Michael shouted, You're gambling with all of us. Richard's tone cut cold. Better to gamble than surrender. Claire leaned forward, whispering fiercely, "If we don't strike first, we'll drown." Emily lingered near the door, torn between loyalty and fear. Thunder outside cracked, rattling the glass as if punctuating every argument. The boardroom became a battlefield of words, alliances shifting silently with every glance. Richard slammed the table. "No one leaves until we decide our next move." The empire hung in balance, suspended in the silence that followed. Later that day, Richard sat alone in his office, rain streaking the glass behind him. The city hummed with whispers of his collapse. He stared at headlines flooding his tablet, each more brutal than the last. Claire entered quietly, placing a steaming cup of coffee on his desk. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said. Richard smirked bitterly. "Sleep is for men not at war." Claire leaned closer, her voice low. "If you fall, they'll erase everything you've built." Richard's eyes hardened. "Then I'll fight them all." Outside, sirens wailed, as if echoing his defiance. That night, the rival finally emerged. Across the airwaves, Alexander Pierce, the manipulative tycoon, appeared on live television. At 50, with silver hair and a charming smile, he spoke with venom hidden in velvet tones. "Kane Global was built on shadows," he said, "and shadows cannot survive the light." Richard watched from his office, rage rising as every word struck like a blade. Claire muttered, "He's painting you as the villain." Richard clenched his fists, whispering, "Then I'll give them a villain worth fearing." Outside, the storm cleared, but the war had only just begun. The morning air was heavy as Richard Kane entered the office, every step echoing suspicion. Whispers followed him down the corridor, employees lowering their eyes as though guilty. Emily Carter approached cautiously, her voice trembling. "Richard, another leak has surfaced." He froze, his jaw tightening. Claire Donovan emerged from behind, her tone sharp. "It's coming from inside. Someone is feeding them." Michael Grant appeared suddenly, arms crossed, smirking faintly. "Or maybe you've already lost their faith." Richard shot him a glare. "I haven't lost anything." Yet his chest tightened, knowing the betrayal was closer than he dared to admit. Inside the boardroom, voices rose again, suspicion dripping into every word. Richard said, "We are bleeding because someone here is a traitor." Michael leaned back, sneering, "Or because the truth finally escaped." Claire snapped, "This company survives on unity, not doubt." Emily clutched her notes nervously, whispering, "Journalists had files no one outside should see." Richard slammed the table, his voice thunderous. "Then someone among us is selling our blood for silver." The storm had passed outside, but inside the tower, lightning still cracked with betrayal. Each glance exchanged carried the weight of suspicion. Later that afternoon, Richard retreated to his private office, shadows stretching across the floor. He opened a sealed folder left anonymously on his desk. Inside were documents, proof of deliberate leaks traced back to someone close. His heart pounded as he flipped each page, the betrayal crawling into his veins like poison. Claire entered quietly, spotting the folder. "What is it?" she asked. Richard's voice broke into a whisper. "Someone I trusted has sold me out." The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic. The walls of Kane Global felt tighter, darker, more dangerous. The evening descended with whispers of revolt. Richard gathered Claire, Michael, and Emily in the strategy room. "We find the spy tonight," he declared. Michael scoffed. "Blame is easier than leadership." Claire shot him a glare. "Deflection makes you sound guilty." Emily trembled, her voice cracking. "Do we even know who to trust anymore?" Richard's eyes darkened, scanning their faces. "Trust is earned in fire," he said. "And tonight, we'll burn away the lies." The air felt suffocating, the fluorescent lights flickering above like unblinking eyes. Somewhere within these walls, loyalty had already rotted into betrayal. Near midnight, Richard walked alone through the silent halls of Kane Global. Shadows stretched long, the building itself whispering secrets. He paused outside the server room, noticing the door slightly ajar. Inside, a figure slipped out of sight. His pulse quickened as he entered, the hum of machines filling the air. Files were open on a glowing screen, evidence of someone stealing the company's lifeblood. Richard muttered, "The enemy isn't outside. It's here." His reflection on the glass of the server racks looked like a stranger. The war had changed. Now it was a hunt, and the prey was within his walls. The morning sun broke through the clouds, but Kane Global's tower stood under a darker storm. Reporters swarmed the entrance, their cameras flashing like weapons. Inside, Richard Kane sat at his desk, reading legal notices spread like knives across the surface. Claire Donovan entered briskly, her tone sharp. "They filed lawsuits, Richard, 3 major ones." He muttered, "They want to bury me in paper and headlines." Michael Grant stepped in, smirking, "And it might just work." Richard slammed the notice down, his voice cutting. "Let them come. They'll choke on the empire I built." The battle had only sharpened. The boardroom became a war zone as shareholders dialed in through glowing screens. One demanded, "We can't survive this chaos." Another shouted, "Step down, Richard, before you ruin us." He rose, glare sharp. "You want me gone? You'll have to drag me from this chair." Claire whispered fiercely, "You can't show weakness." Michael folded his arms, watching with quiet satisfaction. Emily Carter took frantic notes, her hands shaking. The voices on the screens echoed like a mob's roar. Richard raised his voice above them. "I built this from nothing, and I won't hand it over to cowards." That afternoon, Richard faced the press. Reporters shouted questions like daggers, flashes exploding around him. He stood tall at the podium, his voice measured. "Kane Global is stronger than the lies written about it." One reporter pressed, "Are you guilty of fraud?" His jaw tightened. "I am guilty of ambition, not deceit." Claire stood at his side, eyes scanning the crowd for threats. Michael lurked behind, smirk widening. Richard's words carried strength, but inside his chest, the pressure crushed him. Every question was another blow, and every flash another reminder of his fragile empire. By evening, smear campaigns blanketed television screens. Richard sat in his office, multiple monitors displaying his face twisted in cruel edits. Headlines screamed betrayal, greed, collapse. Emily whispered, "They've turned the nation against you." Richard muttered, "Public opinion is the cheapest currency." Claire placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice steady, "But it's also the deadliest." Michael chuckled, "Sometimes truth needs no enemy." Richard spun toward him, fury blazing. "Sometimes betrayal hides behind smirks." Silence fell heavy, the air electric with accusation. Outside, the city lights flickered like embers of a dying fire. The night deepened as Richard gathered his closest circle in the strategy room. "Every hand is against us," he said, his voice low. Claire replied, "Then we fight with sharper claws." Emily added softly, "What if the walls close completely?" Richard stared at the glowing maps and charts spread across the table. "Then we burn the walls down," he said. Michael's eyes gleamed with something unspoken, a shadow hiding behind his smirk. The room felt colder, the silence heavier. The war for survival was no longer about victory. It was about who would remain standing when the dust cleared. The storm had cleared outside, but inside Kane Global, the atmosphere was suffocating. Richard Kane entered the boardroom, his face carved with exhaustion. Claire Donovan whispered, "We're losing allies by the hour." Michael Grant leaned forward, his voice cutting, "Because we're following a leader drowning in his own lies." Richard slammed his hand against the table. "I've carried this empire longer than you've carried loyalty." Silence spread like poison, every eye in the room shifting nervously. The walls seemed closer, the lights harsher. Something in Michael's gaze glinted like steel, a secret he was no longer hiding. That afternoon, Emily Carter entered Richard's office with trembling hands, a folder pressed to her chest. "You need to see this," she whispered. Richard opened the file, his eyes narrowing as betrayal spilled from the pages. emails, payments, signatures. Claire stepped closer, breath caught in her throat. Richard whispered, "Michael has been feeding them everything." Emily nodded, her voice breaking. "He's the one who leaked the memos." Silence thundered in the room. Claire muttered, "The enemy was sitting at our table all along." Richard's fists clenched, his empire's blood staining the paper in his hands. Richard stormed into the boardroom, the folder clutched in his hand like a weapon. Michael looked up calmly, smirk tugging at his lips. Richard threw the papers across the table, shouting, "You sold me out." Michael rose slowly, his tone dripping with venom. "I saved myself, Richard. You were already sinking." Claire's voice cracked. "You betrayed all of us." Michael sneered. "No, I survived." The tension snapped like glass under pressure. Richard's glare burned with rage, but the betrayal had already poisoned the room. The empire shook, not from outside blows, but from a knife driven from within. The board fractured instantly, voices exploding in chaos. Some sided with Michael, others defended Richard, but suspicion poisoned every word. Emily tried to calm the storm, shouting, "We're tearing ourselves apart." Richard's voice cut above the noise. "I built this empire, and no traitor will take it from me." Michael laughed coldly. "It's already gone, Richard. You just can't see it." Claire's eyes burned with fury. "You've destroyed everything." The shouting echoed through the tower like thunder, the company itself trembling under the weight of betrayal. Loyalties had shattered, and there was no turning back. Night fell heavy on the city as Richard stood alone at his office window, his reflection fractured by raindrops. The betrayal replayed in his mind, each word from Michael another wound. Claire entered quietly, her voice low. "He's building a coalition against you." Richard whispered, "Then let him. I'll fight fire with fire." Emily appeared behind her, eyes wide. "But at what cost?" Richard turned slowly, his face hardened by rage. "At any cost." The city lights flickered below like dying embers, the empire trembling on the edge of collapse. The war inside had become more dangerous than the storm outside. Dawn broke, with an uneasy silence over Kane Global. Richard Kane sat at the head of the strategy table, charts and documents scattered before him like weapons of war. Claire Donovan leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Michael has the board in his pocket." Emily Carter whispered, "Investors are threatening to pull out." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Then we hold them hostage with the truth." Claire raised a brow. "Do you even have proof strong enough to silence him?" Richard's tone was steel. "I don't need to silence him, I'll expose him." The room felt like a bunker, the war finally reaching its peak. That afternoon, the boardroom transformed into a battlefield. Executives filled every seat, tension crackling like static. Michael Grant entered, confidence radiating, his smirk sharper than ever. Richard rose, voice firm. "This empire will not be stolen by betrayal." Michael retorted, "This empire already fell. You're just clinging to rubble." Claire interjected, "Enough. The truth will decide who leads." Emily displayed financial records on the glowing screens, proof of Michael's backdoor deal. Gasps filled the room. Michael's smirk faltered, but his eyes burned with defiance. Richard's voice thundered, "You betrayed us, and today the world will know." The confrontation ignited into chaos. Michael slammed his hand on the table, shouting, "You can't bury me. I am this company's future." Richard shot back, "You're its rot, and I'll cut you out." Claire's voice rang through the storm, "Stop this madness before you both destroy everything." Emily pleaded, "Please think of the people whose lives depend on this." The tension was unbearable. Every word a weapon, every silence another wound. The storm outside returned, rain slashing against glass like knives. The empire itself seemed to tremble as loyalty, betrayal, and survival clashed in fire. Later that evening, Richard took the stage at a press conference, cameras blazing, the nation watching. His voice steady, he declared, "Kane Global has been attacked from within, but truth will survive treachery." Reporters fired questions, flashes bursting like lightning. Claire stood at his side, silent but resolute. Emily monitored the feed, her hands trembling. Michael appeared in the crowd, smirking from the shadows. Richard's glare locked on him as he continued, "This company is not a carcass to feed on, it is still alive." The words echoed like a battle cry, but doubt hung heavy in the air. As midnight struck, Richard returned to his office, the city glowing below like a restless beast. Claire confronted him, voice low, "You've thrown the gauntlet, but hell'll strike back harder." Richard whispered, "Then let him." Emily entered, tablet glowing with new headlines. Michael denies allegations. Richard clenched his jaw. He thinks he's untouchable. Claire placed a hand on his shoulder, eyes fierce. "Then tomorrow we finish this." Richard stared at the storm rolling back in, his reflection fractured in the glass. The Empire's fate would be decided not by survival alone, but by who dared to seize control and fire. The boardroom was silent, filled with shadows as the final vote loomed. Richard Kane sat at the head, his face carved by sleepless nights. Michael Grant stood tall across from him, smirk unshaken. Claire, Donovan whispered, "It's now or never." Emily Carter clutched her tablet, her voice breaking. "The votes are nearly split." Richard rose, his glare like fire. "I will not surrender this empire." Michael's tone cut like glass. "It was never yours. It belongs to those who can keep it alive." The tension was unbearable, the decision that would end everything just seconds away. The chairman announced the results, his voice shaking the room. Michael smirked, victory glinting in his eyes. Richard's fists clenched, his jaw rigid, but he stood unbroken. Claire muttered, "They chose him." Emily whispered, tears welling, "It isn't fair." Michael declared, "The Empire has a new master." Richard's voice thundered, "No, Michael, you're a thief draped in respectability." Executives shifted uncomfortably, loyalty splintered. The storm outside cracked lightning, illuminating the fractured faces around the table. Power had shifted, but the war of wills was not over. Richard Kane would not vanish quietly into the shadows. Richard left the boardroom, his footsteps echoing like a funeral march. Claire followed, her voice low, "You still have allies." Richard stopped at the glass window, overlooking the storm-slick city. "Allies don't win wars, strategy does," he muttered. Emily caught up, desperate. "What will you do now?" He turned, his eyes cold steel. "I'll make sure Michael's throne turns to ash beneath him." Claire's expression softened with grim resolve. "Then we fight in the shadows." Richard's reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. Haunted, ruthless, unbreakable. The Empire was gone, but the battle was far from finished. Later that night, Richard convened with Claire and Emily in the dim strategy room. Maps, documents, and secret files covered the table like weapons ready to be drawn. Claire whispered, "If we go underground, we can still cripple him." Emily added softly, "The press will follow Michael now, not you." Richard leaned forward, voice low and venomous. "Then we strike from the dark, where the press cannot see." Silence settled, heavy and sharp. The storm outside howled against the tower, as though the city itself bore witness to a fallen king plotting his revenge. As dawn broke, Richard stood alone at his office window, the storm finally clearing. The city stretched beneath him, cold and indifferent. He whispered, "They may take the throne, but they'll never erase the king." His reflection stared back, hollow yet unyielding. Claire entered silently, watching without words. Emily lingered in the doorway, uncertain of what remained. Richard placed his hand on the glass, eyes narrowing with fire. "This war isn't over," he muttered. The screen faded to black, leaving only the echo of his defiance. The Empire had fallen, but its ghost would haunt the victors forever.